Hello, Tony, your deck architect here, back on my channel once more with another deck profile. Life's been a little busy lately, so I'm a little late on this one, but with Dimension Force already on shelves and in people's decks, we begin our coverage of the set with a return to the Arc V era for another Legacy deck update. Blooming anew with fresh seeds of new support, today we're going to be taking a look at the Predaplants. So to provide some background knowledge on our hungry friends here, the Predaplants are an archetype of fusion-focused dark plants, released originally in Invasion Vengeance. Played in the Arc V anime by the antagonist Yuri, the Predaplants win games through the use of some very unique mechanics. True to their Predator moniker, the Predaplants aim to generate field presence using both sides of the field, literally feeding off your opponent's monsters to produce advantage. This is done primarily through the distribution of Predator counters that enable a variety of different payoffs. Unfortunately, a lack of consistent ways to spread Predator counters and a lack of viable payoffs for these counters meant that the deck lacked the consistency or power to do anything on arrival. Even with further support in future sets, the deck barely cracked Rogue status, with its only notable contribution to the meta being a choice engine for fusion-focused decks. But that all changes with Dimension Force. New support from this set brings new mulch for this wilting archetype, granting the deck new roots to stand on. With several new playmakers and a new boss monster to boot, the deck finally has the tools it needs to not only start better, but also end on better boards. Coupled by their affinity for producing dark fusion monsters, the deck has huge potential to not only be standalone, but also splashed into other meta strategies like Albaz. In fact, you may have heard of top players like Jesse Cotton playing some variation of this deck in the recent YCS at Hartford. While their variants tend to be more hybridized, today's deck will be focused more on the pure, aiming to take maximum advantage of just the Predaplant mechanics to win games. So with that being said, I believe I've droned on long enough. Without a further ado, let's get into the deck profile. Biting right into things, we begin our deck profile with our primary playmaker in our 3 Predaplant Orphis Scorpio. Now chances are you've probably already heard of Orphis Scorpio before. On summon, Orphis Scorpio can send any monster from your hand to the graveyard to summon any Predaplant from your deck. In most cases, this is meant to summon out your one Predaplant Darlington Cobra, who, when summoned by a Predaplant effect, can, once per duel, search the deck for any fusion spell card. It's this 4-card package that allows any deck to grab any fusion spell from the deck, and is splashable enough to serve as a popular engine for a plethora of fusion decks. But in Predaplants, this play goes beyond just searching fusion spells. Having more than just Darlington Cobra as a target, Predaplant Orphis Scorpio provides you unrestricted access to the entirety of your deck, spawning any Predaplant that you might need for whatever situation is at hand. This allows you to produce a number of different combo routes to create a variety of different boards, some of which we'll explore in our combo component. Regardless, Predaplant Orphis Scorpio is a fantastic starter for the deck, and one that you will definitely be accessing in almost every one of your combo lines thanks to a new card that we'll talk about later. From there, we have our next 2 Predaplants in 3 Predaplant Saracenian and 3 Predaplant Bisblip. Both of these Predaplants possess effects to special summon themselves to the field from a non-field zone, something that is very relevant as some of our fusions require materials exclusively from the field. Saracenian can special summon himself from the hand whenever you would take a direct attack, and can destroy any monster it would battle. This could potentially fade an attack, but also discourages your opponent from fighting further if they want to keep their monsters. Meanwhile, Bisblip can special summon himself from the graveyard while a monster on the field has a Predator counter, but it will be banished when it leaves the field. This is just meant to give your second use out of a Bisblip even after you used it once for a fusion summon. Additionally, both of these Predaplants also possess effects to search when sent to the graveyard. This is meant to refund the fusion plays using them with additional advantage for further plays. Saracenian only triggers when sent by battle or card effect, but can add any Predap card from the deck, meaning that it can add spells and traps on top of the monsters. Inversely, Bisblip triggers when sent to the graveyard in any way, meaning that he also triggers for costs, but only searches Predaplant monsters for a smaller pool of options. Nonetheless, chances are you will be triggering both effects throughout the course of your plays to grab you either into each other or the next part of your combo, as both ensure you can fusion summon efficiently toward any boss monster you desire. Next, we have 2 Predaplant Chlamydio Sundew. Chlamydio Sundew, beyond having a really unfortunate name, can perform a fusion summon using itself and any monster from your hand, field, or opponent's field that have predator counters. And in those cases where it does fuse using a monster with a predator counter, those monsters are treated as dark monsters. Now that last part is sometimes relevant for the super poly aspect of Chlamydio Sundew, but in most cases Chlamydio Sundew will primarily act as a means to just fusion summon using your own resources. Being a fusion deck, Predaplants always appreciate having multiple avenues to fusion summon, and Chlamydio Sundew, being a monster, is one such way that we can access through a card like our Orphis Scorpio. Now, because he explicitly requires himself as part of his fusion effect, sometimes he can be problematic in reaching certain boss monsters. But in most cases, Chlamydio Sundew will be used to start the plays, being a quick summon away into our new fusion to get everything rolling. Moving on from there, we then have our new Predaplant Pendulum monsters consisting of 2 Predaplant Bufollicula and 2 Predaplant Triantis. These Predaplants, being pendulum scales of 0 and 8, can pendulum summon each other and a majority of your other Predaplants, adding the possibility of that to your plays. But in most cases, you'll likely just be using them individually for their scale and monster effects. Bufollicula, as a scale, can perform a fusion summon using monsters from your hand or field. This, like Chlamydio Sundew, is just another means for you to fusion summon, this time being accessible by your Saracenian or Bisblip. As a monster, however, Bufollicula, if used as a fusion material, can add any other Predaplant monster from your face-up X deck to your hand. This acts as a way to recur a different Predaplant pendulum from your X deck, and works fantastically with your Triantis effects to produce cheaper fusions. Speaking of Triantis as a scale allows you to use your pendulum scales as material for a fusion summon, as if those scales were monsters on the field. This is a very nifty effect, as it fundamentally allows you to turn your easily activated scales into monsters on the field for all those field exclusive fusions. Furthermore, as a monster, Triantis, if used as a fusion material, can spread predator counters onto monsters on the field equal to the number of monsters you control. This serves as a payoff of sorts for using Triantis itself for a fusion summon, helping you spread counters as part of your fusion plays. Putting the two together, Bufollicula and Triantis can be used to fusion summon for any 2 material fusion, while recurring Triantis and spreading at least 1 predator counter to the field, for what basically amounts to a 1-card fusion summon into counter setup. And that's pretty great. But it's important to note that Bufollicula is not locked into just using Triantis and itself as a material, and can always just remain in scale to provide a fusion effect every turn. Inversely, Triantis is not locked to being fused purely by Bufollicula, and can simply remain in scale to be used in other turns as a field material that cannot be attacked. How you can use these effects will determine what kind of grind and plays you have on your opponent's turn, so it's crucial that you consider their usage at every stage of your plays. Lastly, wrapping up our Predaplant lineup, we have the 1 Predaplant Cordyceps. Cordyceps, during your standby phase, can banish itself from the graveyard to revive 2 level 4 or lower Predaplants from your graveyard. However, in doing this, Cordyceps locks you out of normal summoning or special summoning any monster except for a fusion monster for the rest of the turn. Now, despite the incredible power that comes with reviving 2 monsters from the graveyard, Cordyceps was not a great card on its initial release. Due to the hefty restrictions that come with the Cordyceps effect, the best you could do with those revived monsters was making a single fusion monster, which at the time of Cordyceps' initial release didn't really accomplish much to further your plays. But thanks to new support in Dimension Force, we now have something we can convert those monsters into that actually enables further plays, allowing us to do more than just a single fusion play afforded to us prior. Furthermore, the introduction of Predaplant Pendulums really helps circumvent the restrictions placed upon us by Cordyceps. Bufollicula helps us fuse using the revived monsters, something that previously could only be accomplished if you revived the Chlamydio Sundew as one of the 2 monsters. Likewise, Triantis allows us to use our scales as field material, allowing us to pseudo-commit more monsters onto the field without actually having to summon them. And thanks to the spell and trap lineup, it's actually quite easy to set up cordyceps in your graveyard before your next standby phase, to ensure that you always have a follow-up play on the coming turn. Finally, wrapping up the main monster lineup as a whole, we have our hand traps consisting of 3 Effect Veiler and 2 Ash Blossom. This is just the standard hand trap package that most decks play, not only for stopping a majority of the meta, but also to be banished for cards like Crossout to ensure our plays go through. Going into the spells, we start with our most powerful spell in our 3 Predaplant. Predaplant is a normal spell that, when activated, allows you to special summon a Predaplant from your hand to then add any Predap card from your deck. In doing this, you will be limited to only summoning fusions from your X deck for the rest of the turn. Acting as both extension and consistency for the Predaplant deck, Predaplant is undeniably a huge playmaker for the deck. By summoning any Predaplant from your hand, you can then add any Predaplant support that you would need to enable said summon Predaplant further. This effectively allows you to craft perfect synergistic setups for some really cool plays. For example, by summoning an Orphis Scorpio off of Predaplant, I can then add a Bisblip to my hand to then be sent by the Orphis Scorpio to get 2 monsters out of the deck. For another example, by summoning out a Chlamydio Sundew with my Predaplant, I can then grab a Saracenian from my deck to my hand to be fused with the Chlamydio Sundew for a fusion play into another search. At worst, I can special summon a random Predaplant to grab any Predap card that I might need. Putting one more Predaplant onto the field will also help me get into a starter. And sure, the card does have the potential to be dead if you don't have a Predaplant to special with it first, but considering that any hand with a single Predaplant and Predaplant could still potentially be a start to a combo, I'd say that the potential brick is perfectly worth the risk for running Predaplant at 3. From there, we then have an equipped spell in 3 Predapruning. Predapruning allows you to target any Predaplant in your graveyard, revive it, and then equip Predapruning to it. Should Predapruning leave the field, so does the equipped monster. This is just an archetypal premature burial. For absolutely no cost or restriction, you can revive any Predaplant from your graveyard to do whatever you want with it. This not only includes your main deck Predaplant starters, but also your fusion monsters as well, meaning that you can just as much use this effect to restart a play as you can to just go for damage. And being not once per turn, you can even use multiple copies of this card to facilitate OTK's late game. And given that Predaplants are a fusion deck, it's not hard to load up the graveyard with a single Predaplant to make Predapruning live, meaning that this card is rarely ever dead in your hand. Pairing with that Predapruning is the one Predaponics. Predaponics, a continuous spell, has a maintenance cost of 800 points every one of your standby phases. And for that cost, every one of your turns, you can special summon a level 4 or lower Predaplant from your hand or graveyard with its effects negated. Now, unlike your Predaprunings, Predaponics really limits what you can do with a special summon monster. With the summon monster's effects negated, you really can't start plays with a Predaponics. But, under the assumption that you're using that summon monster as a material, that really isn't that big of a negative. As a continuous spell, Predaponics can be used every turn to generate a steady flow of bodies for fusion material. And with its ability to summon from the hand on top of the graveyard, Predaponics also helps you get bricky Predaplants out of your hand for fusions from the field. At worst, Predaponics allows you to revive a Saracenian or Bisblip, both of which can be crashed into an opposing monster to facilitate a search, giving you at minimum some level of setup in a desperate pinch. Moving on to our fusions, we begin with the archetypal fusion in the one Predaprime fusion. Predaprime fusion is a quick play spell that can only be activated while you control a Predaplant monster. It allows you to perform a fusion summon of a dark fusion monster using monsters from either field, so long as 2 of those monsters are dark monsters we control. Now, because Predaplant fusion requires a minimum of 2 of our monsters for the fusion summon, the only time you'll be using your opponent's monsters is when fusion summoning a dark fusion that requires 3 or more materials. And let me tell you, there are not a lot of dark fusions that need 3 or more materials, and even less that you can make using generic materials. As such, the amount of times you'll actually be using Predaprime fusion for its super poly-esque effect is very limited. In most cases, you'll be using Predaprime fusion as just a searchable way to fusion summon at quick effect speed, allowing you to either make plays on your opponent's turn or dodge targeting effects on your turn to ensure your plays resolve. This card is definitely a tech choice, but being able to search into a spell means of fusion summoning is sometimes pretty nifty for disruptions, and thus we settle for it nonetheless. Then we have another fusion spell in the 1 Ultra Polymerization. At the cost of 2000 light points, Ultra Polymerization allows us to fusion summon using 2 monsters we control. And upon doing so, we can then banish Ultra Polymerization from the graveyard to target the summoned monster and then revive its materials with their stats at 0 and their effects negated. This effectively allows us to facilitate a costless fusion summon, producing a fusion while still retaining its materials. Now, in prior profiles where you've seen me use Ultra Poly, I've used this effect to pivot from a fusion summon into a different extra deck play afterwards. But in Predaplants, this instead allows us to produce different fusion lines with the same materials. For example, by summoning any Dark Fusion with Ultra Poly, I could then revive the materials to then have the material requirements to make a Dragostapelia. Alternatively, if I can gather the materials to already produce a Dragostapelia, I can use Ultra Poly to then revive its materials to make a second Dragostapelia. This makes Ultra Poly a card with some powerful combo implications that only expand the later you use it. With that being said, the 2k life cost can be a bit steep, and the card can be dead in certain board states. But the fact that it can be searched by your Darling Cobra means that we can afford to play this card at 1 to access when we need it for maximum benefit. Then, wrapping up the remainder of our spells, we have the 1 Instant Fusion as a fusion spell to access a specific fusion monster that we'll talk about later, 1 Super Poly to out opposing fields, 1 Foolish Barrel to send a Saracenian or a Blissbit for a search, 3 Crossout Designator for those hand traps, and 1 Call by the Grave for a similar purpose. Finally, wrapping up the main deck with the traps, we have 4 traps consisting of 1 Predaplanting and 3 Infinite Impermanence. Now, there's not much to talk about with Infinite Permanence because it's practically in every deck, but I believe Predaplanting deserves some more explanation. Predaplanting, when activated, allows you to send a Predaplant monster from your deck to the graveyard to then spread Predator counters onto all face-up monsters on the field. This is one of the very few ways that you have of actually spreading Predator counters, and it's likely the only one that can do so en masse. This is meant to help enable payoffs like Chlamydia Sundew or Dragostapelia, while also dumping a Bisblip or Cordyceps to the graveyard for future setup. Additionally, should you successfully fusion summon a monster while Predaplanting is in your graveyard, Predaplanting can banish itself from the grave to target and destroy a card on the field. This is meant to give our fusion plays a bit of an extra bite, but also comes at the benefit of helping us chain block the on-summon effects of some of our fusions. Combined with a card like Predaplant Fusion, we can even trigger this effect on our opponent's turn for disruption as well. Now, because it's a trap that really doesn't do anything without other cards, it's definitely not a card you want to run too many of. But as a searchable trap with so many payoffs, it's definitely something you want to include at least one of to bolster your end boards. Going into the extra deck, we start with the win con of our deck in the 3 Predaplant Dragostapelia. Dragostapelia is a dark fusion monster that requires a fusion monster and a dark monster to make. Now this means it's definitely not a fusion you can make right off the bat, but one that you're going to have to build up into. Luckily, with cards like Ultra Polymerization and the various fusion effects at our disposal, this is not as hard as you might think. Going into its effects, Dragostapelia can, once per turn, target an opponent's monster and place a Predator counter on it. This is currently your most consistent way of spreading Predator counters onto monsters, and it being a soft once per turn means that you can do so a number of times per turn for each individual Dragostapelia you control. This also feeds into Dragostapelia's second effect, which is a continuous effect that negates the activated effects of any of your opponent's monsters with a Predator counter. This lockout ability is the primary payoff for all your counter spreading effects, turning cards like Predaplanting into ways to passively negate fields. Because the effect is continuous, it applies for as long as Dragostapelia remains on the field, and so long as a monster has a Predator counter. And with so little ways to remove extraneous counters in the game, it's likely that once applied with a Predator counter, that monster will remain locked from its effects until Dragostapelia leaves the field. Now, to achieve Dragostapelia, however, is still a feat in of itself. Getting the necessary fusion materials of a fusion and a dark monster can be costly, but thankfully it's a little less costly thanks to our newest Predaplant fusion in the 3 Predaplant Ambulomelitis. Ambliomelidus is another dark fusion monster that just requires 2 Predaplants to make. This is by far the easiest monster in your deck to access, and it being a level 5 means it's also accessible by instant fusion. When summoned, Ambliomelidus can add a Predap card from the deck graveyard or face-up X deck to your hand. This is straight consistency with little to no downside. Furthermore, while on the field, Ambliomelidus can target a Predaplant monster you control or an opponent's monster with a Predator counter, tribute it, and then special summon a Predaplant from your deck. This is a very important effect, as it acts as a way beyond Orpheus Scorpio of tutoring out Predaplants to the field. This also acts as a way into Orpheus Scorpio that you can access with any 2 Predaplants for double the field access, and that is huge for the Predaplant deck. Prior to Ambliomelidus, there really wasn't an intermediary fusion that the deck could go into that helped you bridge you into your Dragostapelia. With Ambliomelidus, you have both the means to grab your next fusion effect, but also access whatever dark monster is necessary to fuse with Ambliomelidus to make Dragostapelia, finally giving the deck consistent access to its boss monster. From there, we have our tech Predaplants in the 1 Predaplant Trivial Veritum and the 1 Predaplant Chimera Rafflesia. Both monsters are cards that you can optionally access to better handle certain matchups. Trivial Veritum can be made using 3 dark monsters on the field, meaning it's likely the only target in your deck that you can make using an opponent's monster through Predaprime Fusion. While on the field, Trivial Veritum gains the attack of all other monsters on the field with a Predator counter. This includes not just your opponent's monsters, but yours as well, meaning that you can theoretically put Predator counters on your own monsters as well to indirectly pump your Trivial Veritum to high attacks. Furthermore, while on the field as a fusion summon monster, Trivial Veritum can negate the summon from your opponent's X deck, and while in the graveyard, Trivial Veritum can revive himself to the field so long as your opponent controls a monster with a Predator counter. These additional effects make Trivial Veritum a pretty worthwhile monster to invest resources into, as the first effect can deny plays in ways Dragostapelia cannot, while the second effect allows you a continuously recurring body by way of Dragostapelia's counter placement effect. Chimera Rafflesia, on the other hand, can be made using a Predaplant and a dark monster. Given that all your Predaplants are also dark, this means that Chimera Rafflesia can be practically made using any 2 Predaplants. While on the field, once per turn, Chimera Rafflesia can target and banish 1 monster with a level less than it. This effect is just decent removal, but it also takes advantage of a minor benefit of your Predator counter placing effects, which also modulate a monster's level to 2. This means that you can combine Chimera Rafflesia with any of your counter placers to potentially banish any monster with a level. Additionally, should an attack be declared involving Chimera Rafflesia, Chimera Rafflesia can decrease the opposing monster's attack by 1000 while also increasing his own by 1000. This gives Chimera Rafflesia a battle threshold of a minimum 4500, which can get over a lot of things. Lastly, on the following standby phase in which Chimera Rafflesia will be sent to the graveyard, it can add any Polymerization or Fusion spell card from the deck to your hand. This provides you some decent recovery for if Chimera Rafflesia would ever get outed, but also gives you incentive to fuse with Chimera Rafflesia to proc this effect proactively. All in all, Chimera Rafflesia is an option you can access instead of Ambliomelidus that is a little more offensive, great for outing opposing monsters in an established board state. Next, we have the Fusion Dragons, which have become synonymous with the Predaplants as their theme boss monster in the 1 Starving Venom Fusion Dragon and its new evolution in the 1 Starving Venom Predapower Fusion Dragon. Both monsters have similar generic fusion materials. Base Starving Venom can be made using 2 dark monsters on the field, while Starving Venom Predapower Dragon can be made using a dark fusion and a fusion monster. These semi-generic fusion requirements make both dragons fantastic super poly options, but also work well with the general characteristics of the Predaplant strategy. Base Starving Venom is a powerful counter unit, able to gain an opposing monster's attack on summon and copy their effects. It also nukes your opponent's field of their special summon monsters on death, making him very hard for your opponent to deal with safely. Inversely, Starving Venom Predapower Dragon is more proactive, able to negate a card effect by tributing any monster on the field with a Predator counter. This unfortunately means that he'll only be live once you can spread Predator counters, but it inversely means that he's negation that additionally facilitates removal as well. Furthermore, should a fusion summon Starving Venom Predapower Dragon be sent to the graveyard by your opponent's card, it can revive any dark monster from your graveyard. Humorously, this can also revive himself, which functionally gives him 2 lives to work with. He's also treated as a Predaplant monster always, a text included purely due to localization issues, which means that he also interacts with all your Predaplant support cards, unlike base Starving Venom. This gives him a few additional tricks to work with. Unfortunately, he's definitely not the easiest thing to make, and in most cases, it's not a card you want to go into unless you're already set up to win. But in those situations, he definitely is a monster that can seal up the game with his game warping effects. Finally, wrapping up the X deck with some generic options, we have the last fusion in the 1 Guardian Chimera as an alternative to Trivial Veritum when you can't get 3 darks on the field. We then go into some links with 1 Relinquished Anima as well as 1 Link Creepo that we can link Abyss Flip into to get some utility effects but also trigger its search. We have the 1 Cross Sheep to trigger a revival effect when we fusion summon, as well as Aromaseraphy Jasmine as another way to access plant monsters from our deck. Now it's at this point that we once again reach the combo component of our deck profile. Now Predaplant is a pretty flexible fusion combo deck, capable of easily chaining fusions after fusions to produce powerful boards. As such, for this combo component, we're going to be doing some test hands. What's going to happen is I'm going to draw a hand of 5 and then try to build the best board possible with what I open. From there, I'll then break down how this board can interact with my opponent on the following turn, and then how I would seal up the game from there. With that being said, I believe that the deck is shuffled, the field is ready, so let us begin. Getting right into it, the hand that we're going to be working with today is going to consist of 1 Ash Blossom, 1 Predaplant Chlamydia Sundew, 1 Effect Veiler, 1 Predaplant Orpheus Scorpio, and 1 Super Polymerization. Now, as useful as cards like Effect Veiler and Ash are, in a Predaplant deck that needs the materials, they are bricks until we reach a certain board state. While we have opened the Orpheus Scorpio alongside the Chlamydia Sundew, in this specific hand, these cards actually conflict with each other as both of them are normal summons that we can use to start our plays. With that being said, only one of these monsters allows us to tutor our deck, and that is our Orpheus Scorpio, so that's the one we're going to be starting with today. We're going to begin by normal summoning out this Orpheus Scorpio, using its effect to send the Chlamydia Sundew from our hand to the graveyard, to then special summon a level 4 or lower Predaplant monster from our deck, of which will special summon out a Predaplant Darlington Cobra. Now, Darlington Cobra, when summoned by the effect of a Predaplant monster, then allows me to add a fusion spell from my deck to the hand, of which I'll add an Ultra Polymerization. From there, I can then immediately activate this Ultra Polymerization, fusing the Darlington Cobra and the Orpheus Scorpio to then summon out our Predaplant Amblyomelitis. Amblyomelitis on fusion will then allow me to add a Predap card from my deck to the hand. Now, I want something that I can use without actually having to commit to the field, and that's generally going to be our Buffalicula for its fusion effect. From there, we can then activate the other effect of our Ultra Polymerization, banishing it from the graveyard to target our Amblyomelitis and revive its materials with their stats at 0 and their effects negated. But that really isn't an issue because we can then activate Amblyomelitis' second effect, targeting our Darlington Cobra to tribute it, to then summon out another Predaplant monster from the deck to the field, of which our preferred target will be our Saracenian. We're then going to be able to activate the Buffalicula in our Pendulum Scale using its Pendulum effect to fuse the Saracenian alongside the Amblyomelitis to then make a Predaplant Dragostapelia, of which our Saracenian will then trigger to allow me to add another Predap card to my deck, to my hand, of which I'll add a Predaplanting. From there, as simple as that, I'll then set the Predaplanting alongside the Super Polymerization and then pass turn to my opponent. Now, going into our opponent's turn, this field generally doesn't look very threatening. But what if I told you beyond our hand traps, we actually have 4 disruptions available to us? Obviously, what we know on the field is we have a Dragostapelia, who can put a Predator counter on one of our opponent's monsters to negate its activated effects with its continuous effect. But we also have access to the Predaplanting, which not only allows us to put more counters on our opponent's monsters, but also send a Predaplant monster from the deck to the graveyard, of which will send a Predaplant Bisflip to then use its search effect to add a Cordyceps to our hand. Now, why is this important? Because now it provides us a discard fodder for our Super Polymerization. Now, Super Polymerization does require our opponent to maybe commit monsters that we can fuse with, but the fact that we actually have monsters valid for a fusion summon already on our field means that even if our opponent isn't playing dark monsters, we have a play. At any point, we can activate the super polymerization, discarding the cordyceps from our hand to the graveyard to fuse Dragos Tapelia alongside the Orphis Scorpio to then produce a second Predaplant Dragos Tapelia. In doing this, not only do we get an additional counter placement by this new Dragos Tapelia, but we can then also trigger the Predaplanting in our graveyard as well, banishing it to pop a card for 4 disruptions. But that's not even counting the fact that we still have 2 hand traps, denying our opponent upwards of 6 times for this turn, but for facilitating an OTK that I'll showcase next. Assuming that we burnt both hand traps in the prior turn, how do we facilitate an OTK on the coming turn? Well, recall for our super polymerization, we discarded a Predaplant Cordyceps for its cost. In that coming standby phase, we could then banish the Cordyceps to then revive 2 Predaplant monsters that are level 4 or lower, of which I'll revive out the Predaplant Chlamydia Sundew and a Predaplant Saracenian. Now, we can't special summon anything but fusion monsters for the rest of this turn, but that's all we're going to do. We're going to activate the effect of our Chlamydia Sundew, fusing it alongside the Saracenian to then make a second Predaplant Ambular Melittus, of which both our Saracenian as well as our Predaplant Ambular Melittus will trigger to add 2 Predap cards from my deck to the hand, of which I'll add a Predaplant Triantis and a Predapruning. From there, we can then activate this Predapruning to then target the Dragos Tapelia in our graveyard and revive it to the field, before then activating the Triantis and using Buffalicula's effect to fuse it alongside the Triantis, thanks to Triantis effect, alongside the Ambular Melittus on the field for 3 dark monsters on the field. Then that allows us to make our Triple Vertum. From there, a few effects will trigger. Our Buffalicula trigger to add back the Triantis, but the Triantis effect will then allow me to place Predaplant counters on monsters on the field equal to the number of monsters I control. This allows me to put additional counters on my opponent's monsters, sure, but it also allows me to put 2 counters on my own Dragos Tapelius, which in turn will then feed its attack to our Triple Vertum to make it 8200. From there, we can then also activate our Dragos Tapelius effect to then put more Predaplant counters on our opponent's monsters, and in doing so, this will allow our Triple Vertum to get massive attack points, potentially being a one-shot all on its own. But regardless, we can use our Dragos Tapelius to clear the field, and even without empty monsters on our opponent's side of the field, 8200 is enough to OTK our opponent with just Triple Vertum. Now let's try another quick test hand. The second test hand we're going to be working with today is going to consist of 1 Predaponics, 1 Predaplant Chlamydia Sundew, 1 Predapractice, 1 Crossout Designator, and 1 Predaprime Fusion. Now this hand has definitely more Predaplant cards than our last hand, but it doesn't contain the Orphis Scorpio that really starts all our plays. Thankfully, we've opened a Predaplant monster alongside the Predapractice, and that's all we need to do a lot of things. We start by activating this Predapractice to special summon out this Chlamydia Sundew. In doing so, we can then add a Predap card from the deck to the hand, of which I'll add a Predaplant Saracenian. Now this might seem familiar to you, we're then going to activate Chlamydia Sundew, fusing it alongside the Saracenian to then summon out a Predaplant Ambular Melittus, of which the Saracenian in the graveyard and the Ambular Melittus will both trigger to add us 2 Predap cards from the deck to the hand, of which I'll add a Predaplanting and a Predaplant Bisplip. From there, we can then activate the Predaponics, using its effect to revive any of the level 4 or lower Predaplants from our graveyard, of which we can then use the Ambular Melittus' second effect to target it, tribute it to summon out a different Predaplant from our deck, and that allows us access to our Predaplant Orphis Scorpio. Orphis Scorpio will then trigger, allowing me to send the Bisplip from the hand to the graveyard to this special summon out the Darlington Cobra to the field, of which both Darlington Cobra and the Bisplip will trigger to search me both a Ultra Polymerization as well as a Buffalicula. From there, we can then activate this Ultra Polymerization, fusing the Ambular Melittus alongside the Darlington Cobra to then summon out our Predaplant Dragos Tapelia, of which we can then banish the Ultra Polymerization in our graveyard to then revive back the Ambular Melittus and the Darlington Cobra. Then we can activate the Buffalicula using its fusion effect to then fusion summon with these 3 monsters to then summon out a Triple Vertum directly from our X deck, of which we'll then set the Predaplanting, set the Predaprime Fusion, and the Crossout Designator, and then pass turn to our opponent. Going into our opponent's turn, let's once again do a head count. As always, I've ended up on the Dragos Tapelia, who can put a Predator counter on our opponent's monsters to negate their activated effects with Dragos Tapelia's continuous effect. But we've also ended up on a Triple Vertum, which can gain attack depending on the monster we plus counters on, but also negates summons as well. Backing that up, we also have a Predaplanting, which can send a card like Cordyceps or Bisplip for a follow-up, but also put more counters on our opponent's monsters for further negation and further attack gain. But in a desperate measure, we can then also activate the Predaplant fusion, fusing the Triple Veritum alongside the Dragostapelia to access another Dragostapelia, or more uniquely, our Predapower Dragon, a monster that can then take advantage of those Predaplant countered monsters we place to tribute them to negate other monsters on our opponent's field. This in turn will also trigger out the effect of our Predaplanting, which we can banish to then pop a card our opponent controls. Going then into my following turn, we still have a few effects that can end the game. We obviously have the Predaponic to revive a monster, we have the Profilica to fusion summon into another big monster, we likely have the Cordyceps to revive 3 monsters, but if there are still monsters with Predaplant counters, we can also revive the Triple Veritum as well, who, thanks to those counter monsters, can gain massive attack to seal the game. And that's going to do it for our Predaplant deck profile. So to be honest, I really like where this deck is at right now. From its barely playable beginnings as this weird counter level deck to now this turbo fusion deck, the Predaplants have really grown in to finally settle in on its weird gimmicks. And thanks to outside support from fusion engines like the DPE package or the Owlbaz engine, the deck has a lot of potential to grow even further. Obviously, the deck still has a few kinks, and the strategy is still somewhat prone to collapse from a single hand trap. But I think with a few reworks on the ratios and a good enough fusion player, the deck can definitely see the top it deserves. But I digress. This has been Tony, your deck architect, with a Predaplant deck profile. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you guys next time.